presentation on the history of war photography and the effect that it has had on our world. So, jumping right in, the history of the camera. So, it was first invented in 1839 by French artist Louis Daguerre, and you can see an example of a daguerreotype on the left side of the screen. These were pretty simple, basic photographs to begin with. Since then, we've come a long way with the technology and modern cameras, but initially they were pretty basic and they functioned for artistic and scientific purposes, which, I mean, it's pretty much the same to this day. And the first examples of war photographs were taken during the Mexican American War. And to this day, only 38 exist, which I think is really interesting. Um, these weren't very widespread and they were, kind of expensive and rare to come by. So, again, the fact that 38 still exists today is pretty interesting. Also, the fact that there's only 38. Going forward into the historical influence, so photography becomes the dominant cultural influence in the 1860s, which is also during the Civil War. So people now are able to view things that they are so far removed from, especially during the Civil War, where people have sent off their husbands and their sons and their brothers off to this war, and all of a sudden they're able to view what the reality of that war is, and people are able to see these things firsthand, whereas they never would have before. Well, I suppose it's secondhand, but people were able to engage in topics that um, they never really would have before, like political debates and discussions that cover topics that may have been reserved for certain groups of people from certain experiences, where now others feel like they can relate to that experience through viewing photographs. So, some of the first photos of war that were made available for public viewing was from the Battle of Antietam, one of the most gruesome battles in the Civil War. And people are viewing this like real people, death for the first time in history, that other than being directly involved in the war as a soldier, that people just weren't used to. So I'll do a little disclaimer right now. I'm going to show some real photos of war, so they may be shocking. So if you just want to skip ahead, that's all right. So starting off is, as I said, 1862, The Dead of Antietam by Andrew Gardner. So these images are very shocking, and they're real soldiers from the Civil War. And even being so far removed by time and space, we can still be shocked by these images. And I mean, just imagine seeing photographs for the first time, and this is what you're seeing. Um, Jumping ahead a bit to World War II in 1943, this is the Warsaw Ghetto Boy from an anonymous photographer. And again, another shocking image of the reality of war and what people are going through in a place that is so distant from what we know, and even from people at the time may have known. Um, and you can see what the image depicts, and it's just, again, really shocking. Speeding through this more is the Saigon. This is the Saigon execution from Eddie Adams in 1968. So this won the Pulitzer Prize in 1969. This is from the Vietnam War, and this had such massive cultural influence, especially in America. And it's really interesting how people are able to see an image from a place so far from their own, and they're able to relate to it so deeply. Seeing the humanity in the image, and um, just their interpretation of things, which they never would otherwise, because it's, again, such a far off place from what they know. So again, just very interesting. And this carries on even today. This isn't the most recent photo, but again, just showing the shocking reality of war. And there's so many examples that we can see today. It's so pervasive in media. And so we can ask, what is the effect that we have today? So one of the main effects comes with the idea of desensitization. So, the theory of desensitization says that with repeated exposure to violence, people become numb to the violence. And this numbness is thought to make people more accepting of violence and even more violent. And this can be seen not only from people who experience violence firsthand or in childhood and traumatic experience, but it can be found in people who experience it through mass media. So again, the effects of viewing these things can have very negative consequences. And I think that begs the question, what do we do with these things then? Do we censor all war and other things? But Jenna Jennifer Evans kind of tackles this question in the book The Ethics of Seeing, and we're able to get this idea of static versus ethical photography. And it's really interesting. So Jennifer says that a static photograph is one that doesn't evoke any emotion or doesn't have any action behind it. It's like seeing a photograph of a bombing where there's just a bunch of rubble and you're not able really to connect to the photo in any way, and it's just kind of devastating. Whereas an ethical photograph can create a sense of action or a sense of um, ethical response from viewing the photograph. So there's a real reaction and a kind of reaction that points towards a positive thing, where you're able to see the humanity and kind of be inspired to change in a way that influences the world to where there's a better outcome at the end of the day. So, one of the things that really inspired me to tackle this topic was the works of Dan Eldon, who is a war photojournalist. My uncle got me his collection of his journals for my birthday, and just flipping through, this is just like one example of what it some of his journals may look like, but um, him being a young war journalist, he was actually killed during his work. He was stoned while photographing a war. He was stoned to death, and I think looking at his work, we can see that real difference between static versus ethical photography, where his work kind of shows the humanity in people and making that connection and the positivity that we can see. And even when these horrible things and tragedies happen, no matter what side of a war you may side with, these horrible things happen, and you can really connect better with what you're viewing and try to create an ethical response out of it rather than just seeing some static, devastating image. And I think this is so relevant for today with what we see in Israel and Palestine and Russia, Ukraine, and other conflicts around the world. You're able to scroll through Instagram or flip on the news and see just such devastating images of buildings collapsing and people being torn apart, and it's just really shocking, awful things. And I don't think that the response necessarily should be to just turn off the television and pretend like it doesn't exist. And I don't think the answer is to lean into desensitization and become numb to it, but rather have some sort of ethical response that can help inspire change in the world. So I hope you guys are intrigued by this topic. It was really cool to research, and thank you for watching.